All right, good morning. I'm Ronald Woodall with NAFECO. We appreciate each person being able to join us today. We're excited about this opportunity. NAFECO's been a representative of Bridgehill for many years. We stock their products and are proud to be partnered with them. So this morning we want to share some information. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it over to Bridgehill for them to share on what we have for this morning.
All right, Ronald, thank you very much. Thank you for your time and opportunity. First of all, I just wanted to inform everyone that this webinar is being recorded, and then that also want to thank NAFECO for the partnership through all these years. What you also wanted to inform everyone, right in front of you, you have a contact QR code. So if you are already planning on asking some questions and you want to get in touch with NAFECO, please, you can just use your phone and scan that so you have access to contact information. On the lower side, you can also, utilize the phone number or email if you want to type that in manually. Well, let's jump right into the today's agenda. So today we will be covering a brief introduction of Bridgehill and who we are, so people get, for those who are not familiar with us, you get familiar with who we are, and then the challenges from EV fires, a little bit correlated with containment and related to containment fire blankets. And we'll talk about the difference between suppression and containment. We'll also clarify concerns about fire blankets and how do you utilize them correctly, so that's cleared, and best practices in Q&A. So at the end, we have that opportunity for you to ask through the chat. So on the lower part of this page, you will find, the opportunity to ask questions there. This will take approximately 30 minutes, and then at the end, we'll have the Q&A space. All right, so some of the essential points that I hope everyone that we can cover through today, and I hope that you will understand and remember. It's going to understand how fire blankets are used correctly. And also, one of the other points would be to understand what will be the difference between suppression and containment. And what would you want to suppress and what would you want to contain? All related to lithium-ion battery fires. And I will also want to for you to understand why oxygen should only be introduced upon blanket removal and when to remove a blanket, right? So shortly about Bridgehill, we are a fairly new company founded in 2014. Our technology was inspired by the NASA inflatable heat shield that allows us to develop extreme EV-rated fire textiles made of pyroxene and graphite. We are located in approximately 50 countries and growing. Our technology, as I mentioned, has basically developed with 3 different layers. In the middle, you have this graphite or pyroxene being the core fabric. And on the top and the bottom, you will have a coating. That coating is going to be there to combat toxic smoke and toxic gases, and the core fabric is there to combat the flames. So hope this explains a little bit how our fire blankets basically work. So for also about our certifications, fire blankets are basically a very new product out there. It's a really new method to how to deal with fires. So it's really important that we have certifications. We do have, like DIN SPEC certifications. They are the first ones globally focused on fire blankets for containment of lithium-ion battery fires. So as we do also, as you can see, we have other types of certifications, but the ones that are most relevant would definitely be those DIN SPEC certifications. So let's jump right into the most important topic of the webinar will be those challenges. And so what are the challenges from EV fires? So I know that some of you guys are pretty knowledgeable on this matter. You probably have some information. So this webinar will cover some of the information. Will be obviously will be aiming on containment. So for this matter, we'll be covering this slide explaining the thermal runaway in maybe a different way that if you guys are used to probably listening to this. I like to explain it in two kind of phases. So right in front of you, you have like, the one phase that can be a trigger event or an internal chemical breakdown, and the other phase that can be off-gassing and ignition. The reason why I like to divide this into kind of two main zones is because when one battery cell goes into thermal runaway, the trigger event or the internal chemical breakdown, that can actually react in minutes or years. So that process can last a very good amount of time, right? Well, the second stage, off-gassing and ignition, is usually something that happens in seconds. So it's important for us to understand, because one of the biggest problems is reignition risks. In a battery on an EV approximately consists of 7,000 battery cells. And as these battery cells can reignite on its own time, and it can reignite in minutes, and some others can reignite in years, we have a reignition risk. Meaning that right in front of you, we were just creating an example where we say that every 30 minutes, one battery cell is going to start their thermal event. And with 70,000 batteries, in an theoretical example, that would be if you have 70,000 batteries burning every 30 minutes, that's a fire that's going to last a long time, right? So this is just to explain why EV fires become so difficult to control. You may be able to suppress an initial thermal event, but then you have another one coming in 30 minutes. Then you have to deal with that. And then you have another one coming in 30 minutes, and then you have to deal with that. Maybe the other one's coming in 2 hours, and then you have a reignition again. And this is happening. So this is why it's making firefighters, have to utilize copious amounts of water and so much time and effort dealing with these fires. And they're all different. The other issue, aside from reignition risks, is also that they are heavily sealed. So there's going to be a lot of the main source of the fire. It's not easy to access, right? We're talking about several layers. So we're usually talking about every vehicle is manufactured differently, but and it's usually 9 layers. One of the biggest practical barriers are going to be the floor pan metal, which is usually steel, the structural reinforcement, which is high steel, the underbody shield, which is usually aluminum alloy plates, the battery pack casing, which is cast aluminum. So there's a lot of different layers. You have the carpet, even foam. So there's so many layers for cooling agents to have to go through to efficiently suppress. So those are obviously important things that we need to consider when dealing with an EV fire. So some of the risks. Let's talk about what are those risks? As I mentioned, I think we're talking about the stranded energy problem, which is reignition, right? That as long as there is energy in a battery, they can reignite at any time. And then they can reignite in 1 minute, they can reignite in a couple of weeks, months. We've even seen situations where damaged EVs that undergone and a thermal runaway reignited after 2 years. So the other problem is going to be toxic gases, which we will focus on the upcoming slides as a big problem. And it's usually, visually it will look like, this white smoke. And obviously, the spread of fire, which is a problem, but it's not the largest problem. So let's talk about this, toxic cloud and talk about the absorption routes coming from EV fires. So inhalation is definitely the worst type and the most dangerous absorption route. This is where you can have situations where people can inhale high concentrations of heavy metals. But you also have other absorption routes. Skin contact, eye contact, and ingestion can also be harmful for your health. And depending on that concentration, they can be really bad for your health or fatal. So for firefighters, this is obviously an issue. We're talking about a pretty toxic cocktail of gases. This obviously is going to go into your PPE. So we see that it's not only for firefighters who are close to the fire, but we have already good examples in real cases. Last year in Sacramento, there was a Tesla Model S that started to burn. And there were some firefighters without their breathing masks on. So without this, and they were standing approximately 203 to 300 feet away from the fire. The toxic cloud was blowing towards them. And then they started to inhale these gases. From this, firefighters, for this, 5 firefighters, 4 of them got, pretty sick. 3 of them undergo respiratory damage and problems that, they can no longer work. But one of them was, suffering severe fatigue and lung damage. So we see that, these fires are not only harmful for firefighters very close to them, but even, long distances. This is obviously a big problem, but it gets actually worse. So another problem that we see is that that even if you have inhalation as a big problem, you're going to have also residue. So a lot of these fires, when they're this heavy due to wind, all these heavy metals can start to blow and with the wind and be transported pretty far away from the main source of the fire. And we see situations where these toxic metals have flown miles away from the incident because of wind. And this is obviously very negative, but the other negative element is that these are metals that don't evaporate. So as they move with the wind, they'll stay on the surfaces. And depending on, it could be the walls, the ground, the floor, vehicles, anything, and they will not evaporate, stay there. The other problem is that they're so small that they can become airborne again. So if let's say you have a pavement or like just normal a parking lot, and you have some of these heavy metals touching the ground, if you were to walk or if there's heavy wind, some of these particles can become airborne again, and you can inhale them, which could be obviously negative for people's health. So now we're talking about post-contamination risks as an issue. So let's bring some, not testing, but real data on this. So we already have this video right in front of you is showing how a lithium battery plant burned and generated 55 pounds of heavy metals. What they found was copper, nickel, manganese, and cobalt. On soil samples, they were up to 2 miles away from the lithium battery storage site. So this is no longer a test. These are now facts that, lithium-ion batteries create toxic metals, such as, copper, nickel, magnesium, cobalt. They don't evaporate, they stay on the surfaces, and then they can be spread miles away. So this is a big problem. Obviously, this is a battery plant. So let's put it into EV words. So an EV battery contains roughly 100 to 150 pounds of heavy metals. So that would be worst case scenario what you could spread, right? But the also important element will be like, for if you have a very small airborne concentration of this, heavy metals, just 0.015 milligrams per cubic meter of nickel may already be a problem for your health. So it really takes very small doses for this to have a negative impact for civilians out there. So we're talking about, and all this is obviously, I think all you guys know where I'm heading, and why we will also cover the importance of containment when it comes to EV fires. Before we cover a little bit more on containment, let's talk about recent experimental testing and how it was conducted. So there's been, last year there was some experimental testing done. Right in front of you can see two of them, and both were basically trying to test extreme situations. So and really try to find, okay, how much can we push this tool? By doing so, they also broke protocol. So they didn't utilize, correctly the product. If you put it into simple words, you have a hot cup of coffee, and we were no longer drinking it to see. We're running with the hot cup of coffee. Obviously, the results from running with a hot cup of coffee is that everyone got burned. So when you utilize incorrectly a containment tool such a fire blanket, you may find concerning results. What they found was basically that they lifted the blanket. So on the pictures on the top, you can see a tool that they have developed to lift blankets several times and try to create a chemical reaction with this. For those, just think about backdraft and what happens when you have a fire, when you have fuel inside, when you have flames, and then you introduce, oxygen. Flames will start eating in a confined environment. It will eat the oxygen, so it will be oxygen deprived. And as you introduce oxygen, you have a reaction. Underneath, you have another test was mixing different types of methods, different tools. Underneath the blanket, they require lifting, introducing oxygen again. And so all of this, it's very much correlated with information the firefighters already know. And so backdraft theory, it's already something that everyone is familiar with as a firefighter. That backdraft theory, it's probably something that I like to utilize to basically explain deflagrations. So when there's an incident where you have a reaction from the oxygen on an EV, that's called a deflagration. So it's very similar to the backdraft. So you have basically production of hydrogen underneath the vehicle. It starts to increase. So you have fuel, you have flames, and the flames are eating up that oxygen. As you lift the blanket, you will have a backdraft, right? So this is basically explaining the importance of not lifting a tool that is supposed to deprive an object from oxygen. So if you want to contain something and deprive it from oxygen, the opposite from that will be introducing oxygen. So let's now look at how would a correct deployment look like. And here, I really encourage you guys to look at the graph, because the graph will allow you to show reignitions from that battery. So new thermal runaways. So now you see you're deploying the blanket, you're depriving the object from oxygen, you're going around the vehicle, making sure that it's airtight as much as you can. They're not big air gaps. Fire blankets will always enable some amount of air gaps. It's not going to be 100% sealed, but it's having a huge reaction on the temperatures and the smoke, as you can see in the graphs. So now you see it at 25 minutes. There's a peak because there's a new thermal event, a new reignition under the blanket. And now we see at 59 minutes, another thermal event. At 1 hour and 45 minutes, another thermal event. At 2 hours and 12 minutes, another thermal event. And then after many hours, the temperatures start to decrease. You can see that, it's basically mirroring the exterior temperature, and then the blanket is removed. So in this case, we're talking about thermal event that lasted approximately 2 hours. And that, if you're comparing that with suppressing it for 2 hours, a lot of water. And as we have learned also, there's a lot of toxic, heavy metals being spread through the environment. So this is usually how you would utilize correctly. As you can see, temperature has dropped, and now you remove the blanket. At this point, obviously, it's 18 hours, so they wait a lot of time to remove the blanket. But there's obviously no flames, there's no fuel, there's no flammable gases inside or anything like this, making the removal of the blanket really safe. So let's talk about best practices. So what happens when you deploy a blanket? So we are merely obviously stopping the spread of fire. As long as the blanket is big enough to cover the burning object, you will cover that, and that will, stop immediately the spread of fire. But we're also, isolating those toxic gases. And as we saw before previously, we're talking about a spread that can go, in worst case scenarios, 2 miles of, heavy metals spreading to the environment. And which is obviously good for the environment, but we're also reducing stranded energy risks. So the reason why we're saying this is because when you're containing the blanket, a containment blanket will be on top of that object. If it reignites because of reignition risks, it's still contained. So the results are the same. So as long as you're going for this approach, it becomes, pretty much very predictable. So obviously what we're doing is drastically reducing the levels of oxygen once you deploy a containment blanket on an EV. So what is important to understand is that a battery cell will increase hydrogen levels, it will create hydrogen. So as these hydrogen levels start to increase, we're basically saying that fuel levels have now increased. So as fuel levels increase, you have fuel levels higher, you have flames. We're only lacking one thing if you wanted to create a deflagration, right? So you have a high environment fuel of rich in fuel with flames. So what we want is not to introduce oxygen. So the testing that was done last year, they did that to create this reaction. So what you want to do to safely remove a blanket is to combat that, fire triangle. So you want to make sure there are no more flames, but also to be even more sure, you want to make sure that there's no more fuel. So what we do is once you deploy a containment blanket, you're there to immediately start following the temperature. The temperatures are going to tell you approximately if there's a fire or not underneath that blanket. Our recommendations is, to have, the temperatures below 150 Fahrenheit. So, and obviously there may be worst case scenarios, like let's talk about 110 Fahrenheit environment, and, you deploy the blanket, you will be probably hitting the 200 Fahrenheit as the threshold to start removing the blanket because it's a very, very, warm day. And then you will have also the CO levels. Now we're talking about fuel. So now we're making sure once we know the flame, the heat, it's being removed. Now we're going to make sure that there's no fuel. So now we utilize atmosphere detectors to measure CO levels below 3 ppm and LEL below 10 without lifting the blanket. So fire blankets will have, as you can see right on the lower front of this, there's going to be a little kind of call it like a little tunnel where you'll see that oxygen is actually can go in and out there. There's going to be like a venting point, and this allows you to measure, the CO and LEL levels. So you want to get near without lifting the blanket and measure those levels. Once they're at approximately, the threshold, then you can start removing that blanket. So we will send you, to be more specific, NAFECO, we will be sending you an email with also our safety protocol that covers this in more detail than I have. So you have that as a reference. It's really important that you also are creating as a firefighter your own protocols. And just to be clear, so if we have, I haven't really seen the attendee list, but if we have any industrial companies or customers who are interested not on utilizing fire blankets as a firefighting tool, let me clarify how would you utilize a fire blanket. So fire blankets were there for you to deploy, only to be removed by firefighters. So, and for those who, I can explain to you also a different way of utilizing fire blankets. And it could be let's say you have a parking lot, you're a industrial facility, you have an EV starts to burn, it's burning, it's a very dangerous situation. You want to have, breathing masks covering your full face. And then you will want to deploy the blanket on vehicles next to the burning vehicle to stop a catastrophic event from happening at a safe distance and a distance that you feel safe and comfortable with. This will allow maybe 5 vehicles to burn instead of hundreds. So that's just another way that, you can utilize fire blankets in case, we have non-firefighters attending. So we also have webinars where we cover a more industrial focus, so that will come up in the future. Fire blankets and how to utilize water on them. So this is a very common question, right? So can I utilize water when I'm utilizing a containment blanket? Yes, you can. When? Prior and after deployment. So our recommendation, and based on all of our knowledge, is that you will want to, prior to deployment, you will want to basically utilize it if there's heavy torching conditions, a lot of flames, where you as a firefighter think, well, this is a lot for me to expose myself to. So I want to knock down those torching conditions or the flames first, and then deploy. So you would want to do that and then deploy the blanket, and then right after removal, after you follow the protocol that I mentioned before, then you will be ready to. Then you can also utilize water. Another thing that I can mention, so for those who maybe you were fire department who has a nozzle, an under nozzle, a piercing nozzle, and you would want to utilize it, how would we recommend you to utilize that? So usually you would want to protect the ground when you were doing this. If you have like a several structure situation, maybe a 3rd floor garage with an EV burning. So what you want to do is to then rapidly deploy that nozzle underneath the vehicle. You're protecting the ground, and then deploy the blanket, right? One of the facts that I know is that why would you want to do that? Well, first, because you don't want to lift the blanket after it's been deployed. But most importantly, because the tires will most likely burn, and then you will explode, and then you will have the chassis at ground level, and placing underneath, an object when the vehicle is so low will become very difficult. So let's go really rapidly. So how would a proper usage look like? So you will want to assess the vehicle and the fire risks prior to deployment. Make sure if it's just an AV, it's this hybrid vehicle, what are we talking about? Is there an indication of a thermal runaway? Sometimes you can hear a fuzzy sound, that is a sign of a thermal runaway. Sometimes that's not present. You can see torching situations. There's also a sign of an EV fire. Sometimes none of those are present, but you still have a thermal runaway. So you want to prepare your deployment, with PIP or an SCBA, and you want to create a safe distance for also a safety parameter. Deploy quickly, centered, and seal the blanket. It's really important that when you're deploying the blanket, you have a good speed, that you're centered, so the blanket is going to be properly deployed on every single angle of the object or the vehicle. Right after that, you want to start monitoring with your thermal imaging camera. You want to, then after, the surface temperature is below 150 Fahrenheit, you want to measure the LEL and CO levels. LEL below 10% and the CO below 33 ppm. You do this without lifting the blanket. And you can also add an extra safety feature if you want by removing the blanket utilizing a rope. So with a carabiner, you can attach this to the handle and then increase the distance from removal. So rapidly, before we finish, I want to cover suppression versus containment. So I want to have this little comparison. Let's talk about, suppression. When it comes to time, so how long would a battery burn? How long would this thermal event last? The reaction, you really don't know how long. And as long as there's going to be stranded energy, there's going to be reignition risks. There's also water can damage components in the battery that can increase probabilities of reignition in some cases. So it's very difficult to know how long is it going to last. But the same goes to containment. You just don't know how long the battery is going to last. But when it comes to the efficiency of suppression, the flames basically will stop once the cooling agent is fully efficient. So when you're trying to stop that spread, you know that once the cooling agent is working, then you have that effect. In the containment, you will have an immediate containment once the blanket is covering the entire object. So those are pretty much similar. But when it comes to the battery fire, as I mentioned before, you just do not know how long it's going to last. The difference is that you do know that it was going to burn and reignite on a confined situation when it comes to containment. But the biggest comparison here when it comes to suppression and containment is not going to be mainly on the current fire, but in the post-contamination risks and the long-term effects from an EV fire, lithium-ion batteries, spreading toxic metals, manganese, cobalt, and so on, that don't evaporate to the environment and moving hundreds of feet, becoming airborne and, probably impacting civilians. So that's where smoke and gases vary. So when you're standing for 2 hours trying to suppress a fire that is spreading toxic gases to the environment, that's going to be a concern for long-term post-contamination risks. But when you are containing this under a blanket, the impact is drastically different. We're not saying that it's 100%. When you deploy a blanket, you will see some level of, toxic metals coming through the ground level of the blanket, but it's going to be incredibly different. It's going to be approximately 90% or more. So post-contamination risks are very, very different when it comes to containment, and that's why the containment becomes such a crucial tool today. It becomes, it's a very important topic to have and understand that these fires have a much bigger impact than we're thinking. Rapidly, I also want to just cover that this also, is the same for enclosed areas where you can have, spread of toxic metals in an enclosed environment, in an office, in a hallway, you see situations where you have like a an elevator, people inhaling high concentrations of this. So obviously, also fire blankets become great tools, such as the one in front of you. There's also containment tools that are much smaller in order to control and minimize damage for smaller situations, not just EVs. All right, everyone. So right in front of you, you have the contact QR code to start. If you want to send any type of questions through NAFECO, please do so. We'll now open up the Q&A. Before we do so, I just want to summarize. So I really hope that everyone has understood the importance of what oxygen does when you are containing an EV with a containment blanket. The importance of making sure there's no more fuel, there's no more flames or heat, to then introduce oxygen and remove a blanket. I hope that you've understood the importance of suppression, or the difference between suppression and containment, why containment can become so important for those long-term consequences from an EV fire. And I hope that you also understand how to correctly utilize a blanket. So I'm jumping right into the Q&A chat. Just give me 1 second. Will there be recording of this video? Yes. So we will share, and NAFECO will share with you a link where you can access this webinar and rewatch this. Share it also if you want. I think we've had conversations with a lot of fire departments who really enjoy the webinar, but they also say, well, I don't know, like I would want, maybe my fire chief or someone else to learn about this. So happy for you to share this. Maybe you can also gather up some of your colleagues and watch this webinar all over again. If you have any questions, please, use also the QR code to contact NAFECO. All right, just 1 second. Will it cover a large SUV? Yes. So we have developed our extra large ourselves. Bridgehill has developed, extra large fire blankets. They're basically designed for the American market, and for SUVs such a Hummer, such a Ford F-150, a Rivian, and large vehicles. And you definitely, in my personal opinion, is always, as a fire department, maybe to focus on what type of vehicles you think you will be seeing yourselves trying to suppress, and then finding a blanket that aligns with that size. What do you do with a used blanket? So how would disposal of the blanket look like, right? So once you have utilized a fire blanket, it comes with an airtight bag that allows you to store that safely to then get rid of it. So you want to treat that accordingly to whatever you have utilized the blanket on. A blanket, a Bridgehill fire blanket, made of graphite and pyroxene, has organic materials that you can dispose just as natural waste. But once you've treated that or utilized it on an EV fire, you would want to get rid of that under your hazmat protocols, depending on each state that you find yourself in. I mean, what do you do with a used blanket? So that's one way of answering that question. I will also answer the question in a different way, and it would be, well, how would you then reuse a blanket if you have a pyroxene blanket that can be reused? So you would want to air it, first of all, for 24 hours or 48 hours at a safe location. So you're airing it first. Second of all, we recommend to do CO2 cleaning, and then storing it. Storing it should also always be done dry. And you will want to also do maintenance on the zipper of the bag. Ensures that it's always airtight. Yeah, guessing they are durable enough for multiple use, or are they a one-time use? So yes, we are very proud of our quality. So the graphite fire blanket is a blanket that's been reused in the field more than 50 times already in the US. And you also have the pyroxene one, which is, we advertise this as a single-use blanket, but we do see even situations where firefighters reuse them. Our tests have shown that you can reuse that more, approximately 5 to 7 times. So they're very durable and high quality, but I think it's important that you also, as you get familiar with a containment blanket, it's not only just about EV fires, it's just a great tool for underground situations, for instance, where you're just deploying this to enable visibility. I'm a big fan if you're encountering yourself in a manganese situation, and magnesium can be, violently ignite when with contact with water and have temperatures above 4,000 Fahrenheit. So for those situations where you definitely do not want to utilize water, a containment blanket made of graphite, it's great. Are there blankets reusable, and how do you control? I think I've already answered that. How do you control hydrogen buildup? So the hydrogen buildup, cannot react if there is, no full fire triangle, right? So what you want to do, and it's what I think I tried to cover in the presentation, was that you will want to measure the heat and the fuel before you introduce oxygen. So if you have high concentrations or high buildup levels of hydrogen and you introduce oxygen, you have a backdraft, a deflagration incident, right? But as you wait for those to start measuring with your thermal imaging camera, your atmosphere detectors, that there's no more flames, there's no more fuel, then you can introduce oxygen, because then the hydrogen levels have dropped, and then you're able to remove this safely. How does fire blankets perform on high wind environments? So on high wind environments, this would be like the ideal protocols. On high wind environments, you will want to deploy with 4 people. Why? Because it allows you to have full control of the blanket, and you want to follow up with you can simply just put a hose around ground level of the blanket to make sure this is not it's controlled. You could also utilize a chain or a rope around the blanket at ground level to make sure it's not going to move. Has anyone had success with filling against the insurance policy to replace blanket used on their car fire? So we ourselves don't sell to the end users, so it's not like we have. I can share a story that I've heard once, like 2 years ago, from a Canadian fire department, and they told me that they had already initiated insurance where they were charging the reusability aspect of a blanket. So let's say a blanket made of graphite was utilized. That is the one that you can reuse. It was utilized on an incident. And then they said, well, we consider this product that can be reused up to 20 times, and then divided the cost into 20, and then they charge an insurance company for that usage. And they were actually already doing this. I've also heard situations where they have also charged the entire amount of one's entire single-use blanket. But I have no reference on exactly what state this was, unfortunately, and I will definitely would want to. This may vary from state to state. What is the shelf life and how much they cost? So the shelf life is 10 years, and I'll definitely recommend you to contact NAFECO when it comes to pricing and purchasing. So as you can see right in front of you, we have the email and the QR code. So please contact them for purchasing. Can a Bridgehill's heat block be used on a car fire? So the heat block is there to utilize as to combat radiant heat, and it's more a wildfire situation. So I would not recommend a heat block to be utilized on a car fire, but I could recommend a car fire blanket to be utilized on a wildfire situation. So if you want, let's say, if you have an object and you see that there's fires spreading, it could be from a wildfire, it could be from any type of fire spreading to an object, you can create a fire shield with a blanket to stop that spread. So that will work the opposite way, but a heat block will not be efficient to combat flames. They'll be efficient to combat the radiant heat. Can you deploy the blanket and have it positioned to burp itself if the gas underneath becomes too much? Yeah, so definitely like burping. So here's what we have seen in situations. Fire blankets can burp themselves. They can create some type of pressure. The reason why this can happen is because you also need to know that a deflagration can happen with and without a blanket. Guys, I would definitely recommend you guys to go on Google and just find, situations where you have an EV fire burning and you have a vapor cloud. Nothing is on top of that. It's just moving. The vapor cloud is just goes into a deflagration event, right? So there's a high concentration of hydrogen in that vapor cloud. You have flames, you have oxygen, and they create this reaction, right? All this can happen underneath the blanket. So in some situations, you can have a blanket say lift. The lift because this event basically happened while the blanket was on top. Fire blankets are not a pressured solution that is going to make it sealed, that is going to create a pressure. But I have myself been in a test where this happened. They actually created a pool of water at ground level that when you introduced oxygen, the venting points natural venting points didn't allow hydrogen to flow because they had so much water at ground level. And this is something that I didn't mention when we're talking about water. This is one of the reasons why you do not want to put water on top of a blanket. Once you have a water on top of a blanket and create pools at ground level, then you will find yourself with reading incorrectly levels of hydrogen because you have fully sealed. So atmosphere detectors will no longer be that efficient in that situation. What if the vehicle needs to be moved up the highway shortly after the blanket has been deployed? So if the vehicle needs to be removed after the blanket has been deployed, this is definitely a call that firefighters need to be very aware of. And so the current data that is being provided, I'm not saying it's a fact, but we know this, but just by one example, and it's that hydrogen levels usually increase at about 30 minutes after. So it's not expected. I'm not saying it's a fact because it's very difficult just to say that it's going to happen or not. But what research has showed is that approximately after 30 levels, that's where you can actually create 30 to an hour. And that's where the levels of hydrogen are going to be higher and where you may have a deflagration incident. What we have seen is that deflagrations can happen when you remove the blanket at a too early stage where there's still levels of hydrogen, there's still levels of heat. So what you will want to do is first measure temperatures with your thermal imaging camera. If the temperatures are, hitting 500 Fahrenheit, 700, then there are flames underneath that blanket. And then you would want to follow with atmosphere, detectors. If they're, CO2 levels are, hitting very high thresholds about, 35 or 10, and then there's going to be a high concentrations of hydrogen. And then you should definitely, if you really need to move that blanket, you should already be aware that there might be a deflagration. So you definitely want to utilize a rope and remove that carefully. Remove entirely the blanket and then move the vehicle, and you can then redeploy that blanket. How much of the blanket weight? Approximately 57 pounds. The weight is usually experiences much less when you're deploying. So obviously the weight will distribute itself through the entire blanket. And as you're deploying it, you're not really carrying 57 pounds. You're more like having 10 pounds on each arm. Is there testing supporting initial knockdown with handling the deployment of blanket versus no water applied and immediate deployment of blanket? Well, is there testing supporting initial knockdown? So the knockdown, what we have a lot of testing that you can see on what happens when you deploy the blanket and the temperature drop. And if you have a comparison of what's going to be the difference with water right after the blanket, we do not have a kind of like a mimic test where you will see the difference. No, that's not something that I'm aware of or that has been done. We definitely would want that to happen in the upcoming future to see differences for sure. Do you have any bundle offers for the different blankets? So once again, I definitely, for this question, I will definitely refer you to NAFECO. So please contact them, utilize the QR code, or send an email or call them on the information right in front of you. So on this question, do you recommend weighting the blanket down to get better sealed? So it's important that you are basically stepping on top of the blanket after you've deployed it. You would want to make sure that the fire blanket is touching as much flatly the surface, so you're not creating curls or wrinkles, and that will allow you to have low levels of air gaps, which is what you want to go for. Are there any potential long-term health risks with exposure to smoke and gases related to an EV fire, battery fire? Yes. So are there any potential long-term health risks with exposure to smoke and gases released during an EV fire? So yes, this is definitely one of the biggest problems that we find ourselves in right now. There's obviously going to be a big problem with post-contamination risks for firefighters. Firefighters who are not utilizing the breathing apparatus, as we explained to you guys in the Sacramento fire. That's a big problem. But also it's going to be for other situations where even civilians may find themselves as inhaling these toxic metals in the future. When it comes to post-contamination risks, heavy metals spreading to walls, the floor, and then becoming airborne again, or even touching them and eating something, or touching your eyes and so on. So that's obviously it's going to have a health impact. And there's research also showing that some levels of this doses can have negative impact on your health, increase probably possibilities of cancer and other sicknesses. So does the NAFECO offer any type of site training or burning on cars? Definitely recommend you to contact and utilize the QR code to discuss this directly with them. If you want to utilize this on a wildfire, could you use the fire blanket as a fire shield for your crew? Yes, so you could actually utilize the blanket as a fire shield for your crew. But when you say that, I definitely recommend our heat block. I myself, 3 weeks ago, I think, was participating on a burn. We, say a house that needed to be burned. So the entire house was burning, and we created a shield, a wall with the wood, and then we got closer with the heat shield on a house fire on that I myself went next to without wearing any protection to this heat shield, just to feel the radiant heat. And I was, once I placed my hand on the side, I could feel how incredibly warm it was, and how it just felt like I could, it was basically the same temperature that you can experience maybe 100 feet that you were experiencing right next to with the heat block. So the heat block is an incredible tool to combat that radiant heat. But fire blankets would not have that radiant heat effect, but will definitely protect you from flames. Yeah. Well, thank you, Brian. Yes, about wildfire. It's not that white and silver blanket. Yes, so that's correct. That's what I referred as the heat block. which is definitely what you want to utilize for these situations discussing wildfire. And we do have pictures and videos that we could share. So if anyone wants to those, please contact NAFECO, and we're happy to share those through them. All right, does anyone have any type of questions out there? I'm happy to cover any more questions before we finish the webinar. All right, everyone, thank you very much for your time. This webinar will be shared with you through a link, so you can share that in the future. The safety protocol will also be shared in addition to the webinar link. And you can, we're happy if you want to share that with your friends, your colleagues, and more people. If you have any additional questions and because you forgot to ask, well, we're happy to cover that. Please contact NAFECO, and they can also put you in contact with us. So how much heat can the blanket handle? One last question. So the pyroxene one can go up to 2,500 Fahrenheit, 2,900 Fahrenheit, and the other one can go up to 4,500 Fahrenheit. So the graphite one would be the 4,500 Fahrenheit, and the pyroxene one will be 2,900 Fahrenheit. All right, everyone, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Have a great day.